Dr. King drew an analogy between the civil rights movement and the team that makes a commercial airline flight possible. He told the audience that whenever he soared into the sky on an airplane, he was mindful that the undertaking was very complicated and required a substantial team. The pilots were the highly visible known component, and there was a larger cohort of unknown ground crew and support staff. The work of that unknown cohort was essential for the flight to take place. Dr. King self-identified as a known component of the civil rights movement and emphasized that he accepted the award on behalf of the movement and each of the unknowns. Today, when we reflect on and celebrate Dr. King's short but spectacularly consequential life, we pay tribute to his majestic scorn for risk and danger. That disdain freed him to march, to kneel and pray with his back turned to potential assailants, to accept arrest, and to stand and deliver his monumental "I've been to the mountaintop" address in Memphis. By honoring Dr. King, we also honor those countless others, the unknowns as he called them, whose sacrifices were never chronicled. Those of us present that are old enough to recall watching evening news broadcasts on black and white television will recall the scale of the marches in Birmingham and Selma very vividly as we saw the collective manifestation of transformative courage and conviction of many. We can, as we celebrate Dr. King, recall the names of some of the martyrs and heroes: Medgar Evers, James Meredith, and Jonathan Daniels from Keene, New Hampshire, 2 hours northwest of Boston, for example. However, most of the thousands of individuals that marched are forever nameless. We're grateful and proud that Dr. King was an alumnus of Boston University. The foundation of his greatness was in large part poured long before he graced our campus with his presence. We understand that in some measure his beliefs, his ideas, and his persuasive rhetoric were both tested and refined here with members of our faculty, including Howard Thurman, whose commitment to a spiritually and physically integrated society and to nonviolence served as major influences on Dr. King's life. Each of us are abidingly grateful for the example set by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for his powerful teaching, for his unwavering commitment to nonviolence, and for his scorn for risk and danger, as he exerted monumental leadership and moved our country closer to justice. Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming BU student Karina Spinola.
Good morning. My name is Karina Spinola, and I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a graduate of Boston Latin Academy, and I'm class of 2026 here at Boston University, studying biochemistry in the College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you. Today, I'm going to read an excerpt from Martin Luther King Jr.'s Nobel Prize lecture. Following the reading, I will introduce Mayor Michelle Wu. This evening, I would like to use this lofty and historic platform to discuss what appears to me to be the most pressing problem confronting mankind today. Modern man has brought this whole world to an awe-inspiring threshold of the future. He has reached new and astonishing peaks of scientific success. He has produced machines that think and instruments that peer into the unfathomable ranges of interstellar space. He has built gigantic bridges to span the seas and gargantuan buildings to kiss the skies. His airplanes and spaceships have dwarfed the distance, placed time in chains, and carved highways through the stratosphere. This is a dazzling picture of modern man's scientific and technological progress. Yet, in spite of these spectacular strides in science and technology, and still unlimited ones to come, something basic is missing. There is a sort of poverty of the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The richer we have become materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually. We have learned to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple art of living together as brothers. I will now introduce Mayor Wu. Michelle Wu is a daughter of immigrants, a Boston Public Schools mom, and the first woman and person of color to be elected mayor of Boston. A fierce believer in the power of community and collaboration, she is committed to building a Boston where housing is affordable, transit is accessible, growth is sustainable, and every community has the resources and opportunities to thrive. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Wu to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Give it up for Karina, who is not only a BU beloved community member, but also BPS alum, so we claim you still. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to join our official City of Boston commemoration event for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you to BU for your partnership, not only for this continuing the very special legacy of both what Boston meant to Dr. King, but also today what Dr. King continues to mean for Boston. Thank you to President Freeman, to all of the team members here, the event planners, and I want to give a special thanks to Director of the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground, Nick Bates. I'm not quite sure how they did it, but between today's event and the Civic Summit that Nick and the team also helped host here for the City of Boston, we're so grateful for all that you do to build community and to empower all of us to work in partnership. I know they've been recognized before, but thank you again to my colleagues in government, Councilor Mejia, Councilor Durkin, Rep. Vitolo, Rep. Honan. We have members of our cabinet here as well. I see our Chief of Housing, Sheila Dillon's in the house, our Chief of Human Services, Jose Masso. I know our incredible age-strong Commissioner, Emily Shea, is somewhere in the audience as well. And thank you to all of our team members. Today is a moment of reflection, a moment of celebration, but also a moment for commitment to the work ahead. We'll hear later from the keynote speakers, Dr. Saida Grundy and Dr. Kienga Yamada-Taylor. And I'm very proud that, again, one of our own, Destiny, is going to introduce both of them in a little bit. And so you'll get all of the insight and wisdom from the day there. I just wanted to reflect a little bit about where we are in this moment in our city and how the journey and the vision that Dr. King laid out for our entire existence as humanity is so intertwined with Boston's role in this moment. It is here at BU where Dr. King came to learn that we can reflect fully on how much he taught us, our city, our state, and our country across generations. He taught us that the democracy that's promised to us should have been working for everyone already. He taught us that justice for all can only be achieved together, and that a more perfect union must be as great as we dream it to be, and that we are willing to fight to secure it. Especially now, when violence and hatred threaten to divide us, it's important that we here stay the course on this journey toward justice that Dr. King envisioned so many years ago. We know the many, many ways in which he was a pilgrim for peace, a drum major for justice. He gave it his all on the quest so that generations of leaders and advocates could take up the torch afterwards and carry on. But I want to note today that Dr. King also held a special place for Boston and Massachusetts in that journey. He chose to come here to learn, to absorb, to refine, and to fall in love And he came back and back. A year after he received that Nobel Peace Prize, he came to Boston. And the day before he led the march with 20,000+ residents from Roxbury to Boston Common, he gave a formal address at the Massachusetts State Legislature. And on that day in April of 1965, he rallied Massachusetts and Boston to do more, to reach further, to go faster, because he said, "It was from these shores that a vision of a new nation conceived in liberty was born, and it must be from these shores that liberty must be preserved." Our special responsibility in this moment of great challenge everywhere is to step up and step into the vision that we know is possible, but only if we're willing to include everyone in our community. So we must continue this marathon toward the unrealized promise of liberty and justice for all, knowing, as Dr. King did, that it won't be easy. In accepting his Nobel Peace Prize, he said, "We must still face prodigious hilltops of opposition and gigantic mountains of resistance. But with patient and firm determination, we will press on until every valley of despair is exalted to new peaks of hope." Dr. King's work is not yet over. And here in the city of Boston, with a coalition of people who, standing firm here in this room and all across our neighborhoods, are working every day to create those new peaks of hope with policies and programs and commitments that reflect what Dr. King taught us. In the coming weeks, we'll be announcing our Reparations Task Force as research partners, which marks the next major step on that journey toward truth, reconciliation, and repair. We're addressing the racial wealth gap by taking action and targeting every possible opportunity so businesses can earn city contracts and empowering more and more residents to purchase their first homes in Boston. We're addressing the gender pay gap. We're seeing that gap decrease between men and women, but racial disparities in pay persist, and we won't stop until we close all gaps. We're working for our collective community safety, setting national precedents when it comes to how our Boston police come together with community members, faith leaders, neighborhood leaders, and partners to envision safety that comes from the ground up. We are working to stop displacement by taking every chance to increase affordable housing, to take housing units off the speculative market, and to find every place we can put up more housing. But most of all, and what I shared in the State of the City last week, is that Boston is a place where home is much more than a house. Home is the beloved community. Home is knowing that you belong in every space and every opportunity that this city has to offer. I shared last week many different announcements of the work ahead over this next year and the accomplishments that collectively we've been able to move forward in just a short period of time. But I want to lift up one of those announcements that took a long time to get us to where we are today, and that I want to ask for all of your help in continuing to move forward. Starting next month, 6 of the major cultural institutions in Boston, from our art museums to the aquarium and the zoo and the children's museum, the science museum, will be offering free admission for all BPS kids and their families on the first and second Sundays of the month. This was a hard program to get off the ground because our cultural institutions are themselves in a time of great reckoning. They need our support. They need our commitment, that we value access to our shared history and our shared intellectual connections across every part of our community. It is, in fact, Boston that was the very first place in the country to step up and recognize that we all benefit when we all benefit, to establish the first public schools in the country, the first free elementary schools, the first free public libraries and public parks, subways. And so we continue that today by stepping into a role where our kids, our young people, must feel at home in every space in our city and in the spaces that show them the world. And so we need your help making this program incredibly successful and known and used. Starting this next month, please spread the word. Take some of your neighbors or friends or nephews or nieces or grandbabies. We want to make sure that all of the opportunities that we have in the city of Boston are not just there, but available and owned by the residents of our city. So I want to thank you for all that you do. And I want to thank you in standing firm for Dr. King's vision of tomorrow. It remains so urgent for those of us in our city who are fighting every day for peace and justice and equity, and we will never lose sight of that vision here in Boston. Thank you.
Books, including Race for Profit, how banks in the real estate industry undermine black home ownership, which was a semifinalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2020. She has received a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant in 2021. She has been a contributing writer for the New York Times and the New Yorker. She is a Hughes Roger Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Saida Grundy is a feminist sociologist of race and ethnicity and associate professor of sociology, African American and Black diaspora studies, and women's and gender studies at Boston University. Her research to date has focused upon formations and ideologies of gender and racialization within the Black middle class, specifically men. Using in-depth interviews, her current work examines graduates of Morehouse College, the nation's only historically Black college for men. Quite simply, this work asks how, in light of an ongoing national climate in discourse about young Black men in crisis, the men of Morehouse experience racialization in the process of making manhood at an institution that frames Black male elites as a solution to the crisis and the rightful representatives of racial agendas. Her most recent book, Respectable: Politics and Paradox in Making the Morehouse Man, University of California Press, 2022, expands upon this work. Saida's research interests currently span examinations of masculinity and social justice capitalism, racialized rape culture, and bridging hegemonic masculinity theories to our understanding of campus sexual assault. Her work has been supported by the Boston University Center for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Taylor to the stage. Dr. Taylor will deliver the keynote speech. Following her speech, she will be joined on stage by Dr. Grundy for a dialogue. Thank you.
Hello. I'm very glad to be here. I live in Philadelphia, but I flew in from Seattle from over the weekend. I want to offer particular thanks to Nick Bates and Saida Grundy for the invitation to come here. I love to talk about King, especially on the holiday that commemorates him. I always like to preface my remarks by saying that I offer them in the spirit of provocation, which I think is also a way of honoring the spirit of King. So with that, I will get underway, and then I look forward to talking to Dr. Grundy afterwards further. In 1983, after years of lobbying by civil rights advocates and Coretta Scott King, President Ronald Reagan agreed to sign legislation turning King's birthday into a national holiday. What was ironic about this moment is not only had President Reagan opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ended Jim Crow segregation and banned racial discrimination in hiring, but he had also opposed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Reagan had been a political opponent of King during his lifetime and at the time of his death. On the day of King's funeral in 1968, Reagan described King's death as, quote, a great tragedy that began when we began compromising with law and order and people started choosing which laws they'd break. Conservatives had often reduced the Southern civil rights strategy of civil disobedience as simple lawlessness and struggles against racism in northern cities as violating the norms of law and order. Reagan ended his remarks about King's death by denigrating King and his movement's conception of equality as being outside the boundaries of the American dream. He said, quote, the American dream that we have nursed so long is not that every man be level with every other man, but that every man be free to become whatever God intended. It was a deceitful statement that obscured that black people had been legally debased as second-class citizens without the right to vote across the South only 3 years earlier, and that housing discrimination had only been made illegal after the assassination of King weeks earlier. But in the wake of King's murder, his opponents got the last word. So it was a moment of triumph as old segregationists and their enablers, men like Reagan, were frustrated by the national recognition of King as a celebrated American. Reagan and other members of the Republican Party had buckled under intense public pressure in the form of 6 million signatures on a petition demanding King's birthday be recognized as a federal holiday, But the 15-year struggle to win national recognition for King can also in some ways be considered a moment of tragedy, as the formal canonization of King allowed for his very complicated ideas and politics to be defamed and defiled, twisted into hollow pleas for peace, justice, equality, and colorblindness. That was the trade-off. King could only be a national hero if he were stranded in 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial in search of a world where his children would be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, as he said in his infamous "I Have a Dream" speech, entombed in a casket of idolatry and political impotence. Today, the distortions of King's legacy continue. They are diminished by the deadening repetition and misrepresentation of that 1963 speech, which has been turned into a cudgel by the right to present an agenda hostile to the aspirations of black people as colorblind and benign, even as they dismiss black inequality caused by what they claim is a lapsed personal responsibility, cultural deficiency, and the so-called warped values of black families. Indeed, conservatives who herald King as the king of colorblindness willfully and selectively ignore all of the evidence that points otherwise. In his crucial 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, King wrote, quote, "The majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and steady growth towards a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony. But unfortunately, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity." We can derive from this that King would have supported teaching critical race theory, acknowledging slavery as central to the political, social, and economic development of the United States, that he would have supported DEI initiatives, that he would be in the streets decrying continued attacks on the right to vote, police violence and abuse, and that he would be rebelling against the attacks on affirmative action. In today's parlance, King was woke before woke was a thing. The distortions of King's legacy are not only owned by the right, however. Liberals have also been vested in presenting a distorted version of King as a more palatable version of black politics, compared to the militancy, anger, and destruction that overwhelmed the black movement in the late 1960s, and that reappeared with the dawning of Black Lives Matter a decade ago. On the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington in August 2013, then President Barack Obama crystallized this historical rendering when he said, quote, "If we're honest with ourselves, we'll admit that during the course of 50 years, there were times when some of us, claiming to push for change, lost our way. The anguish of assassinations set off self-defeating riots, legitimate grievances against police brutality tipped into excuse-making for criminal behavior. Racial politics could cut both ways, as the transformative message of unity and brotherhood was drowned out by the language of recrimination. That Obama continued, is how progress stalled. That's how hope was diverted. That's how our country remained divided. This perception of riots as senseless and criminal are placed in contrast to the nonviolent movement that is seen as heroic, which has cemented a notion of King and the riots as essential opposites, with almost no recognition of the transformation of his own politics from the 1963 March on Washington to his emphasis on mass direct action, anti-imperialism, and anti-capitalism at the end of his life. Moreover, in his own time, King refused to condemn the young working-class black men and women who had taken to the streets in rebellion or uprising against the status quo. In his infamous speech, Breaking the Silence, in opposition to the American war in Vietnam, he said at the Riverside Church in New York City, almost 1 year to the day that he was assassinated in 1968, quote, "As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." These distortions of King's legacy are not just benign readings of history given up to different interpretations. Instead, they have been used to rewrite the history of the civil rights movement itself, turning it into a story of patriotism intended to affirm the essential progressive trajectory of American history. In this way, the civil rights movement is remembered as triumph over tragedy, good overcoming evil, instead of as a movement that succeeded in changing the laws of the country and outlawing legal discrimination, but ultimately failing to dismantle the institutional and systemic racism that under-resourced black majority schools, that shunted black workers into lower paying jobs, that erected barriers that prevented black home ownership, all of which contributed to higher levels of poverty experienced in black communities, which in turn made black people vulnerable to hyper-policing, resulting in greater engagement with the criminal legal system, which in turn reinforced the economic and social marginalization of the vast majority of ordinary black people. The movement did undo the laws that made it impossible for black people to frequent restaurants or hotels across the South, but it did not ensure that they would have the economic capacity to frequent those establishments once the barriers were removed. And it did almost nothing to address the extraordinary racism that black people in cities across the North faced in schooling, housing, or jobs. It was an incomplete assault on American racism. In that way, the rise of King and the power of the civil rights movement do not confirm progress as the intrinsic motor propelling U.S. history forward. Instead, King's political trajectory and the radicalization of the civil rights movement into a black political insurgency confirm that in the United States, progress is not guaranteed. Justice is not part of its natural life cycle. Both are only ever the result of enduring social movements, labor movement, and struggle. It is true that King would have been shocked that the election of a black president in 2008 and 2012, that those were significant emblems of change. As is the presence of the largest number of black elected officials ever to serve in the United States Congress is also representative of change. The number of black millionaires, the number of black people making over $100,000 a year is evidence that things have not simply stood still in the United States. But the emergence of the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement would also have been familiar. The ongoing fight for the unencumbered right to vote, the fight for affordable and safe housing, the fight for living wages, for health care, and beyond reveal alarming continuity with the past, not an arc of history naturally bending towards progress. The political radicalization of King, and by radicalization I mean the ways in which he came to see what lie at the root of American racism and inequality, tells us something about why progress stalls, as well as hard truths about what is necessary to achieve real change and transformation. In the early 1960s, the Southern movement had coalesced around clearly defined demands to end Jim Crow segregation and to secure the right of African Americans to the unfettered access to the franchise. With clear targets and barometers for progress or failure, a broad social movement was able to uproot these systems of oppression. King then was lauded as a tactician, as well as someone who could articulate the grievances and aspirations of Black Southerners. But despite the successful example of nonviolent civil disobedience across the South, it appeared to have little, if any, lasting impact on the edifice of racial discrimination that defined Black life outside of the South. Indeed, the seeming permanence of Black exclusion and marginalization across the United States produced hundreds of urban rebellions and uprisings in the middle 1960s. If King's strategic genius in the South was deploying nonviolent civil disobedience to disarm Southern racists while coercing the political establishment into securing first-class citizenship rights, it was a strategy that ultimately failed in cities such as Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. In these places, obnoxious signs of Jim Crow were not the problem. Rather, it was the insidious but obscured actions of the real estate broker, the banker, the employer, the police officer, and other agents that maintained racial inequality. Despite a mischaracterized polarization of the reactionary South versus the liberal North, it was King and millions of other ordinary Black people, their daily encounter with the intractability of job discrimination, poor housing, and quotidian police violence inside and outside of the North that compelled activists towards escalating tactics and more militant protests. Changing race relations in the South, ending Jim Crow, was easy. It didn't cost the U.S. anything to change the law without any real commitment to improving the lives of Black people. Changing the law would no longer allow the enemies of the U.S. At the height of the Cold War to point to the legally degraded status of African Americans as evidence of American hypocrisy. But Black people were interested in much more than a change in legal language. They wanted access to the full range of benefits that were assumed to come with American citizenship. They wanted social mobility, self-determination. In less abstract terms, they wanted good jobs, good housing, good schools, an end to racist police abuse. They wanted the good life. King knew that this desire for a better life was not only in the South, but it belonged to Black people across the country. 5 days after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law in August of 1965, South Central Los Angeles, known as South LA today, exploded in rebellion. In the summer of 1964, there had been riots in Rochester, New York, Harlem, Philadelphia. But the explosion in LA was on a scale unseen in the United States in the 20th century. Over the course of 6 days, Black Angelenos rebelled against the status quo in that city. The results were devastating. 34 deaths, over 1,000 injuries, 4,000 arrests, and the decimation of property valued at $40 million. King traveled to LA. He told reporters that the Watts riots were, quote, the beginning of a stirring of those people in our society who have been passed by the progress of the past decade. Struggles in the North, King believed, were about dignity and work rather than rights, which had been the main goal of Black activists in the South. During his discussions with local people there, King met with Black residents who argued for armed insurrection and others who claimed, quote, the only way we can ever get anyone to listen to us is to start a riot. This was the beginning of an important pivot, not only in the tactical and strategic approach of King, but politically. He was developing a critique of racism and its connection to a political economy that kept it intact. King left the South and headed to Chicago in 1966 to join a campaign to fight a different kind of racism that did not mount signs designating segregated drinking fountains, but a racism that nevertheless forced Black families into segregated and dilapidated Black neighborhoods. Undoing the racism found in cities across the North required more than just changing the law. It meant enforcing existing laws that banned the federal government from engaging in discriminatory actions that violated the 14th Amendment and its Equal Protection Clause. In 1968, King wrote of this dynamic. He said, quote, all too many Americans believe justice will unfold painlessly, or that its absence for Black people will be tolerated tranquilly. Justice for Black people will not flow into society merely from court decisions, nor from fountains of political oratory. Nor will a few token changes quell all the tempestuous yearnings of millions of disadvantaged Black people. White America must recognize that justice for Black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. The comfortable, the entrenched, the privileged cannot continue to tremble at the prospect of change in the status quo. He continued, when millions of people have been cheated for centuries, restitution is a costly process. Inferior education, poor housing, unemployment, inadequate health care, each is a bitter component of the oppression that has been our heritage. Each will require billions of dollars to correct. Justice, so long deferred, has accumulated interest, and its cost for this society will be substantial in financial terms. This fact has not been fully grasped because most of the gains of the past decades were obtained at a bargain price. The desegregation of public facilities cost nothing. Neither did the election and appointment of a few Black officials. The price of progress would have been high enough at the best of times, but we are in an agonizing national crisis because of a complex, profound problem has intersected in an explosive mixture. We have to talk about the radical king. Over the course of the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty and the Great Society, the great social welfare programs of that era, could not keep up with the pace of Black anger. From 1964 through 1968, more than 500,000 African Americans were involved in more than 250 uprisings across the country. This was roughly the same number of soldiers that had been deployed to serve in the Vietnam War. And it was the same war that would be the undoing of the Johnson administration. Over the course of the decade, the war leached crucial resources away from the war on poverty. King began to connect the U.S. war in Vietnam to the deteriorating conditions in U.S. cities. He wrote, "We are spending all of this money for death and destruction and not nearly enough money for life and constructive development. We hear all of this talk about our ability to afford guns and butter, but we have come to see this as a myth, that when a nation becomes involved in this kind of war, when the guns of war become a national obsession, social needs inevitably suffer. King was taking down the wall that the political and economic establishments use to separate domestic politics from foreign policies. He debunked the lie at the core of the Johnson administration that they could deliver guns and butter. And he pointed out how the Vietnam War had made it impossible to satisfy the deep need that existed on the home front. Moreover, an administration invested in the evisceration of the Vietnamese people could not truly be a society committed to developing the human potential of its own people. Between 1965 and 1975, the U.S. and its allies dropped more than 7 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. From the mid to late 60s, young people, among others, including King, were radicalizing because of the slow pace of change. It would be wrong to say that there was no change over the course of the 60s. There was lots, but none of it was enough. The radicalization driven by disappointment with the political status quo, the deepening quagmire in Vietnam, pushed ordinary students, everyday people, and King himself to radical and even revolutionary conclusions. By the late 1960s and the months and weeks prior to King's death, his view of the problems facing Black people became more complex and their resolution more complicated. The failure of government to adequately provide for its citizens while lavishing the military with unquenchable human and financial resources forced King and others to come to different conclusions on how to transform the gross inequities that were strangling American society. For some young people, it led them to rebellion and violence against those they believed to be responsible for their condition. Other young people gravitated towards anti-capitalist politics as they were convinced that American capitalism would never equitably share the spoils of its tremendous riches. Throughout the 60s, the United States experienced tremendous economic growth as it informally became known as the affluent society. And yet the country teemed with riots. In a poll taken in 1967, after the largest riots of the era, 70% of Black people blamed the riots on housing conditions. 59% of Black people said that they knew someone who lives in, quote, rat-infested housing. But most importantly, 70% of all Americans believe that the federal government should create a big federal program to provide jobs and housing to Black city dwellers. But by the end of 1967, when upwards of 20,000 American troops had been killed in Vietnam, driving Johnson to seek even more funding for the war, deepening the U.S.'s commitment to be there, by the end of that year, the U.S. had already spent that year alone $78 billion on the war, the equivalent of spending $679 billion today. But the U.S. could not afford a war on poverty and a war in Vietnam. So in every aspect of life, housing, education, access to jobs, all of the measures of the quality of life, of the good life, for most working class people, that was no longer a possibility. And frustration easily spilled over into violence. King understood the riots as what he described as the voice of the voiceless, but he knew that angry eruptions could not undo the underlying reasons for the endurance of economic inequality. When Martin Luther King left Chicago at the end of 1966, after months of trying to break the colored line of residential segregation in that sprawling city, he too concluded that the Black freedom movement needed different measures of progress when the passage of civil rights legislation, crucial to the development of Black life in the South, had not had any impact outside of the South. King contrasted the difference between ending legal racism and the more insidious forms of institutional racism that could be measured by disparate outcomes. He said, quote, slums with hundreds of thousands of living units are not as easily eradicated as lunch counters or buses are integrated. Jobs are harder to create than creating voting rolls. It is easy to conceive of a plan to raise the minimum wage and thus, in a single stroke, extract millions of people from poverty. But between the conception and its realization, there lies a formidable wall. Someone has been profiting from the low wages of Negroes. Depressed living standards for Negroes are a structural part of the economy. Certain industries are based upon the supply of low-wage, underskilled, and immobile non-white labor. Hand assembly factories, hospital services, housework, agricultural operations using itinerant labor would all suffer shock, if not disaster, if the minimum wage were significantly raised. A hardening opposition to the satisfaction of Negro needs must be anticipated as the movement presses against financial privilege. King came to believe that the racial crisis of the 1960s was deeper than just the question of civil rights. He concluded that the economics of racism meant that neither political party was truly interested in challenging those conditions. What I mean to say is that these were problems that could not be resolved by public policy alone. They had to do more fundamentally with the structure and function of the economy. And within that context, King began to publicly articulate an anti-capitalist analysis of the United States that put him in sync with the rising critiques from the global revolutionary left of criticizing market-based economies. During a conference of his home organization, the SCLC, in a speech in 1967 called "Where Do We Go From Here?" he said, "We must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America?" And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising questions about the economic system and a broader distribution of wealth. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day, we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And it means that questions must be asked. Who owns the oil? You begin to ask, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? For King, it was the gathering Black movement that was revealing the depths of the evolving crisis in the United States. In an essay published a year after his death, King wrote that in these trying circumstances, the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all of its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing evils that are deeply rooted in the whole structure of our society, revealing systemic rather than superficial flaws. And what I interpret him to be saying there is that the entire history of Black struggle and resistance had exposed and brought to the surface the contradictions of American society as just and democratic, and yet the conditions of Black America belied that. By the end of the 1960s, James Baldwin spoke to this dynamic when he said in an interview discussing the socially discombobulating impact of Black activism, "If you move out of your place, everything is changed. If I'm not what the white man thinks I am, then he has to find out what he is." In her book, Freedom is Not Enough, historian Nancy McLean further explained the significance of that quote in pointing out that because the U.S. had confined Blacks to the bottom of society and built so much of its culture on rationalizing the subjugated state of Black people in violation of the professed ideals of the nation, as the Black movement gained momentum, it disrupted every location within the social hierarchy. The very identity of whites was built on their assumption of who black people were. To unsettle that was to bring into question their self-conceptualization as well. As McLean elaborated, if blacks were not who whites insisted they were, then not only were most white men not who they thought they were, but neither were most white women whose standing had long been defined with reference to race. Understanding the problems in the United States as systemic, embedded in its culture, politics, and economy, King pushed King to the realization that even greater forces were necessary to create and achieve a social transformation within the United States. In a story published a week before his assassination, King told a writer from the New York Times Magazine, quote, "In a sense, you could say we are engaged in the class struggle. The civil rights movement had not cost a dime," he reminded. He said, "but the movement to uproot poverty and inequality throughout the country would, quote, be a long and difficult struggle, for our program calls for a redistribution of economic power." Even as King recognized the need for a broader multiracial struggle to successfully engage in what he described as a radical revolution of values, he still understood the dialectic connecting the black movement to a larger reckoning in the U.S. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference called for massive civil disobedience to shut down business as usual in Washington, D.C. This was to be the final campaign, his undertaking, known as the Poor People's Movement, as a way to dramatize poverty and inequality in the United States. And he argued that he said, quote, "The time has come to camp here in Washington, to stay here by the thousands, making it clear that the city will not function until the federal government and Congress do something. These methods can sustain protest as riots cannot until evils are corrected." Roy Wilkins, the president of the NAACP, vociferously disagreed with King's movement and its tactics. In an op-ed written for the LA Times, he excoriated King, writing, "This is a far cry from the Montgomery marches of 1956 and the sit-ins of 1960 and 61. Today's goal seemed to be not the exercise of freedom to dissent, but disruption of services and the insulting of other citizens. This is not freedom of speech, but mafia-like dictatorship." To give you some indication of the tensions that existed between King and the rest of the civil rights coalition. Ultimately, King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, standing in solidarity with black workers who were trying to form a union, sanitation workers who were trying to form a union in that city. Since his assassination, the interrelated flaws of American society have only intensified in the 50 years or so since King first raised them. Indeed, the conditions warranting what he described as class struggle have become worse as wealth inequality within the United States has continued to grow. In conclusion, this annual King holiday should not be an occasion to treat King as a static figure, fixed in time, making a single speech in 1963. But it's also not a time to make speeches where we drop exquisite quotes from King with no real thought about what they mean in the world today in which we live. In some sense, we do like to share quotes from King because of the way that his legacy has been so abused by those who say they claim him as their own, even as they pursue political agendas that were completely anathema to his own. By the end of King's life, he was a Christian revolutionary, a pacifist who believed in the radical redistribution of wealth and resources of this country to the poor and working class and dispossessed. He was vehemently opposed to war and the imperial domination of the global north against the global south. He was a radical. What does it mean to be radical? It means to look underneath to find the roots of the problem. King was not interested in easy, superficial explanations. He searched for the underlying roots of racism, inequality, war, and poverty. He believed in the coercive power of mass protests. He believed that mass protests made ordinary people active participants in their own liberation. He believed it to be a form of, quote, constructive coercive power, which could, quote, forcefully cripple the operations of an oppressive society. Most importantly, King was not cynical or bitter, but was deeply hopeful. And even though he was obviously a deeply religious man, his hope was not rooted in blind faith, but in the deep desire for the world to be different. A world free of racism, bigotry, poverty, militarism, and war, and that we had the capacity to make it so, not through wishful thinking or blind faith, but with the power of the mass movement, organized along the lines of deep solidarity, fueled by a radical understanding of the crises and problems that hold us back. Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming Dr. Saida Grundy to the stage.
So we are so proud to have you here at Boston University. You know, you and I have known each other for some time, and it's mostly a fangirl relationship with me really standing your work, because it puts really into context so much of what Black historians and social scientists have been arguing about, what we get wrong about King, but also what we get wrong about now, right? How we remember King tells us who we are now, right? And he's sort of a human monument in that way. I want to ask you to talk more about the Poor People's Campaign. Because when we talk about legacies of King, these aren't actually abstract.
Right.
Many of them are quite literal. Post-assassination, that year, into the spring, the Poor People's Campaign meets on the Washington Mall, and is really only disbanded because the assassination of Bobby Kennedy means that his funeral procession will have to come through the city, and they sort of, out of respect, sort of pack up the tent in the Washington Mall. When we think about King, and your work teaches us so much about the years post-assassination, when we move from King's idea of economic justice being bottom up to what you call predatory inclusion, meaning that the markets immediately shift to, it's not good to exclude Black people openly from capitalism. How about we find a way to actually prey on them while including the markets? What do you think that the Poor People's Campaign tells us about how King would challenge sort of where his movement got usurped afterwards?
That's a great question. I would say that part of what came with the Poor People's Campaign, which none of us know enough about, because it was an important strategic pivot in King's politics, which, I mean, it's not necessarily in his politics, but tactically, how do you build his notion of a beloved community as a political coalition, bringing together a wide variety of marginalized and dispossessed people, which, inevitably in this country was a multiracial movement that brought black people, white people, Mexican Americans in particular at this time together in a political movement to fight for what the People's Campaign had come up with, which was called a freedom budget. And this was a really kind of social democratic idea, meaning that a belief that the government had an obligation to really create a floor through which poor and working class people could not fall through, no matter what the vicissitudes of the national economy were going through. And this was during a time of, as I said in the talk, of American affluence and expanding American economies before the first wave of recessions that really began to strangle the U.S. economy in the early 1970s. And so there was, a sort of material and real concrete idea that much more could be done because the economy was still growing. And so, I think that the freedom budget is really important. The idea that the state has an obligation. I know there was a slide, guaranteed annual income, that there were resources to be used to alleviate poverty, inequality, and suffering that was happening. And so, one of the things that I look at as cite a reference is this idea of predatory inclusion, the transition from exclusion, excluding black people, to including black people, but on different terms, on unfair terms that are shaped by the years of exclusion. And what I mean by that, and this is why, to me, it's in sync with King's idea about restitution. He says restitution is costly, which is to say that I look at the issue of housing, that you can't have 34 years of legal discrimination in housing, which occurred in the U.S. In 1934, when the Federal Housing Administration is created. They create programs that consciously, deliberately, in writing, exclude black people. And so this is the law from 1934 until 1968. So we have 34 years of legal discrimination. And then legal discrimination is banned. And then the people in charge say, now you are free to go on your way.
And please give us your money.
Yes.
Right.
But what happened to black communities that were excluded from loans, and not just mortgage loans to buy a house, but African Americans could not get home improvement loans, those small loans that allow you to keep up your property. And so the housing in black communities was much older because there was no development. It was in much more distressed condition. And so when legal discrimination was then banned, bankers, realtors used those conditions of dilapidation and deterioration that had been caused because of 34 years of legal redlining and said, oh, look at the condition of your community. We're going to have to charge you more for loans because this place looks risky. You people don't look like you can take care of property. You look like poor neighbors. So now we will use that as the basis to charge you more, right? To give you subprime, meaning less than prime loans. And so those things are connected in the sense that they have their roots and legacy in racial discrimination. And when you don't address that, when you don't address the harm that has happened as a result of racial discrimination, that when the period of inclusion comes, it's inevitably on unfair terms. And so part of the freedom budget was intended to address the unfair terms that had set Black people back, that had made Black people predisposed to poverty, predisposed to inequality, to say that this is not something that has to do with Black attitudes or Black behavior, but that this has been structured into an economy that sanctioned legal discrimination. And the end of, you can't just end it by saying, oh, no more discrimination, without addressing what the discrimination did in the first place.
You know, as a small follow-up on that, because I think you give us such a language to talk about, King's legacy, we almost talk about it passively as though, oh, well, it just, sort of faded, or, we're going to, content of character people to death. But it really was usurped, right? It was very actively, very aggressively, and violently usurped. And so what I learned so much about your work is, even Nixon going into Carter, going into, Ford, et cetera, what they take from King is, well, you can't be openly racist in the same ways, right? They sort of get an iOS update to their racism, right? And in terms, and this affects, what you talk about so well with the markets and what you've been explaining with particularly housing, but how do we actually see that 70s and 80s post-King, because man is very fresh in the grave. This is, not ancient history. What do we actually see as the rollback on King that begins almost immediately?
I mean, I think there are two things. One is, the official canonization that I talked about in the talk, what it means to turn King's birthday into a holiday, even though it was a demand from the civil rights movement, from ordinary people who signed these petitions, who wanted to pay respect to King's legacy. The way that canonization of King then helps to facilitate a national narrative that is really projected onto him, and that does not at all fit his own political development over time, or even how he was viewed at the end of his life. When King was assassinated, he was one of the most reviled figures in the United States, from the political establishment that was aghast that he had spoken out against the Vietnam War, but also from some of his collaborators, or had been collaborators in the civil rights movement. I read briefly from Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the NAACP, was probably the most vociferous critic of King in the kind of civil rights establishment at that point. So there was that, the way that people's legacies can be distorted in death because the person is not here to refute the characterization. But I think that there was also a kind of deliberate effort by conservatives to use King as a prop for colorblindness. I mean, it's still astounding the way that the speech, which actually, when you look at the entirety of the I Have a Dream speech, there are really searing parts of that. Absolutely. That even in its own time, right, in 1963, really challenged this idea that King is kind of oblivious to race, and is just talking about the need to ignore race and focus on color blindness. And then, there's everything that he wrote, especially at the end of his life. People should read his book. Where do we go from here? Where he's in a debate with Black nationalists and activists in the Black Power movement, because he is a pacifist and disagrees with the turn towards political violence. But he's also writing from a place of understanding how people have arrived at these politics at this point because of the intransigence of the political establishment. And so I think that the effectiveness of using colorblindness, projecting that as King's politics, I think one of the reasons that it's effective is because the backlash against the movement becomes focused and intense in a way that paints Black people as unreasonable, as wanting unreasonable things, as being undeserving. It's some of the same things that you hear now that, we spent all this money on the welfare state. The emergence of a Black political class, a Black middle class, was presented as evidence that America had progressed, and even if the
Obama, right?
even if the majority of Black people were still, suffering from inequality. And I think that politically there was a way in which the economic recessions of the early 1970s helped to create an atmosphere where people felt like, well, we've done enough.
Yeah.
And if you haven't progressed,
Something's wrong
then
with
there's
you.
something
Yeah,
wrong.
exactly.
There's something wrong
Yeah.
with you. And I think as long as this politics of there's only so much that can go around, we have to live within the means of our budgets, then it creates an atmosphere of recrimination. It creates an atmosphere that cuts against the idea of solidarity, and certainly against the idea that we do have the resources to solve the problems experienced by poor and working class people in this country.
With that, it seemed like it was really King's campaign in northern cities that really brought him face to face with a different type of struggle he was going to have around anti-poverty and what racialized capitalism meant. So Black conditions in northern industrial cities were perhaps where he realized what poverty, racism, and militarism were doing to Black people, far from the shadows of a whites-only sign and Jim Crow de facto laws. King and his lieutenants were really masterful tacticians at embarrassing the nation by drawing out the backwardness and in-your-face violence of the white Southerner. You talk about this so well in your work. But in the North, his northern allies seemed fine with his movement being contained to the South. But they really turned on him when he comes north and starts talking about Black liberation, right? He hit a hurdle, really, in the North. King always said the place where he feared for his life was Cicero, right outside Chicago, right? A very white enclave right outside of Chicago. But when he brought his call for Black power and liberation to the North, his white allies turned against him. And in fact, he used the example of King organizing against slum conditions on the west side of Chicago and being met with the response from then Mayor Richard Daley, who simply denied that Black ghettos existed, right? That King was just almost disarmed by someone who could just say, I don't even know what you're talking about. Our Blacks are fine here, right? What about King? What do you think that King, as we now have this lens of history, what do you think he misjudged about northern cities that still relates to cities like Boston, your home, Philadelphia, and what we see today, where conditions have not greatly changed for Black people here?
I mean, I think that the whole campaign across the South had two goals, had two very easily defined goals: end Jim Crow and secure the right to vote. And so you could have a kind of tightly crisp, organized campaign that had a discernible objective that you could either succeed or fail. But what do you do when there is no law saying that Black people have to live here and can't live? There's no law that dictates that. What had arranged that in Chicago in particular were decades of mob violence, white homeowners that organized each other so that whenever African Americans breached a certain neighborhood, their houses were bombed.
Absolutely.
In the early 1920s, there was on average something like a Black home bombed once a month.
In every northern city.
Yeah.
I mean, it was
So
really,
so there were informal ways of maintaining residential segregation. But how do you organize a campaign around that? Who is the target of that campaign? So I think, there was an underestimation of what it meant to try to change what we describe now as institutional racism, where you don't need a particular bad actor to be implementing something because they don't like you. But that it is the practice, the kind of impartial, dispassionate practice of bankers, real estate people, the result of which is this exclusion. And so I think that was part of the problem. I think probably his biggest miscalculation was that there were what I describe as Black gatekeepers who had also profited from the arrangement of segregation and stood to lose if segregated areas were integrated or if Black people all went to the suburbs. So some of the fiercest opposition he faced were from the small but influential number of Black elected officials in Chicago in particular, some of the reverends, the religious figures, who had found a niche for themselves within the status quo and weren't necessarily interested in his arrival for them out of nowhere to disrupt this arrangement that had been sort of carefully worked out over the course of the Great Migration from the 20s up into the 60s. That's a long time for routines to be established, reputations to be secured, to all of a sudden have that upended. I think that the two of those, as well as the enormous size of, I think he talks about this at one point, like in some of these smaller southern cities and towns, they're not that big, and you can quickly overwhelm the jail and overwhelm. You got Chicago,
Cook County, you cannot overwhelm. They will make more jails.
Well, he's writing about this. There's a riot, a white riot in this area called Marquette Park, and it's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who have mobilized against King, and it was just like, one, those numbers were enormous, but then, and I noticed this too for myself when I lived in Chicago for 15 years. When I first moved there, a place like New York is probably similar to Boston, these smaller cities, that there's segregation, but it's not like you have to go far if you're in a Black neighborhood.
It's across the street. That's why, Boston's history of violence, as I've always taught my students, is about the immediacy of these neighborhoods are across the street from each other.
So in Chicago, no. You're going miles and miles and miles of just deep, enclosed segregation.
A bifurcated city, absolutely.
Literally, when I noticed it when I first moved in, driving from north to south, that this was literally miles of a quote-unquote Black neighborhood. And so you immediately understand that it's so total and concentrate it, that it can't be accidental.
Absolutely.
I mean, it would be
Absolutely.
impossible for
Absolutely.
this to have just happened.
Yeah.
That it had to actually be organized. And
Yeah.
so I think, maybe he'd have a different experience if he'd come somewhere like Boston.
Yeah.
Or Philly, which is similar, that the city is small enough that, yes, there are segregated areas, but it's like 2 blocks. And then 2 blocks later, you're like in a white neighborhood, But Chicago is a different animal altogether.
And truly, it reminds me that, there are cultural and economic aspects of Chicago's and Boston's and Philly that are very similar. And one is, the racialized class hierarchy is different from the South in that black, repression was so replete in the South that, the white poor were rural, but in southern cities, basically black people were making up all the rungs of your laborers, of your low wage workers. The competition in the North with the white working class was perhaps something that the movement perhaps thought they would respond differently to. What do you think that tells us about, what is it about white self-interest in the North that would keep people who otherwise, much like we see today, otherwise would benefit from this Poor People's Campaign, but were fairly absent from it in terms of their sort of wages of whiteness, as Du Bois talked about, this idea that their currency of whiteness, even as they were also working class and poor, somehow gave them a psychological leg up over black people in the same conditions?
I think there are like 2 things, really. I think one is they're related. One is the economy of scarcity, where we're just told there's just not enough.
Yeah.
So when there's not enough, then everybody's kind of out, for themselves. And to sort of reinforce that is we have an approach to governance where you get nothing, right? Like in the United States, unlike, many of its European peers, although, there's always an effort to try to in government to get closer to the United States, but they're constrained because of the strength of the labor movement. But here you get nothing.
Yeah.
There's no guarantee to education. There's no guarantee to health care. You can work.
Yeah.
And you can get as much as your capacity to work allows you. So it means that the scarcity and the hysteria around scarcity is even more intense. And so if you look at something like housing, well, why is it that you have these white homeowners that are so hysterical, really, about the presence of black people in their communities? Well, because their investment in housing is the largest investment that they have. Their ability to have the value of that housing accrue over time means that you can send your kids to college, means that you can perhaps retire with some relative dignity. And so anything that is posed as a threat to that makes people, anxious and angry. And so, of course, the federal government, and following the lead of the private sector, had made black people dangerous to property values because of this 34-year history where the federal government, again, led by the private sector, said that we won't invest in black neighborhoods because we believe it to be risky. And
just because they were black, there was nothing about the behavior of black people.
It's
just
only
their
because
presence. Absolutely.
It's only because they're black.
Yeah, by lining on no other criteria.
And so it means that it's true that your property value might go into decline. And then because we have a government that offers you nothing except the absolute bare minimum, try living on Social Security if you're a working class person in retirement, that is the bare minimum you get. Then it makes people crazy about property values. So I think the scarce model the acceptance that, well, there's not enough. There's not enough education to go around, so we sprinkle it out. Some people can have access to it for the right price. Some people can't. There's not enough housing. There's not enough good jobs. There's not enough health care. So everyone is scurrying, competing with each other for the limited resources that exist in our state. The federal government makes it all worse because there's no aspect of a welfare state here, and you can't even say it. You know, it's in Mississippi, in Iowa, they have rejected food assistance for children. This is now in our current 21st century
Brett
world.
knows well.
Right. But they've rejected new money for hunger programs for children, and at least now there's no subterfuge. It's like we don't want to expand the welfare state.
And I say Brett Favre mockingly because he deserves to be mocked, but also because it really is. He's not an exception. That in many of these state welfare rosters, they've actually usurped welfare. Welfare is actually going to conservative programs, is going to marriage training, marriage counseling, and also just being taken from poor people. We have, just about a minute and a half left. I want to ask you sort of a bigger picture question. When, you talk so much about the radical king, because king is often presented as a foe or at least someone who's an alternative to black radicalism, right? But actually, King and the mainstream movement had very, not only tenets of radicalism, and also had tenets of using defensive violence, right? They were nonviolent, but they also protected themselves. When we talk about, the color blindness of King's legacy being used against black people, what do you also think about the civil rights movement, how that's used against black activism now?
Oh, I think it happens in both ways, because a lot of the black kids, young black activists, this is not your grandparents' civil rights movement. It's like, well, you don't actually know anything about the
grandparents' civil rights movement. They took far more bullets than you did.
That was
Twitter fingers.
That was a radical movement. Absolutely. And the white supremacist kind of architecture across the South will tell you that it was a radical movement, and there's no other way to understand how that social movement could break a kind of 100-year stranglehold on political power. People often forget the Civil War ended, and then there was literally 100 years, almost to the day, the subjugation of black people under Jim Crow and without a right to vote. The war ended in 1865. Black people did not get the right to vote across the South until 1965. That's like 100 years to the day.
100 years of not enforcing the 15th
and so
Amendments.
So it absolutely was a radical movement that was limited by its objectives. Its objectives was to change the law across the South, not to do all of these other things that King finally concluded, but it inspired black people outside of the South who had gone north, believing it or imagining it to be what was described as the land of hope, only to be confronted by a different form of discrimination. So it only stood to reason that it would take a different kind of political mobilization and organizing to confront that. And I think that the failure to upend that order of institutional systemic racism is, of course, then what leads to the eruption of Black Lives Matter in 2012, 2013, and that has gone on for a decade, because those issues of poverty, disproportionate poverty, under-resourced schools, under-resourced housing, all of that has not yet been resolved, which means
does not provide maximum opportunities for free-flowing circulation among one another works against social and individual health. Any attitudes, private or group, which prohibit people from coming into across-the-board contact with each other work against the implementation of the love ethic. So considered, segregation, prescriptions of separation are a disease of the human spirit and the body politic. It does not matter how meaningful the tight circle of isolated security may be in which individuals or groups move, the very existence of such circles, whether regarded as a necessity of religious faith, political ideology, or social purity, precludes the possibility of the experience of love as part of the necessity of one's life. Thank you all for coming today. Again, remember my instructions from earlier, but thank you all for coming today. So we're welcoming our band back to the stage. You will see